Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture on AP US history. Today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the interactions between American Indians and Europeans, and how they get along or don't get along with one another. That brings us to our essential question 2E for today. Explain how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians changed over time. So these interactions between European rivals, and those European rivals are like France, Spain, England, etc., and American Indian populations are going to foster both accommodation and conflict. So the French, Dutch, British, Spanish colonies, those European rivals, are going to ally themselves with and armed American Indian groups who frequently sought alliances with Europeans against other American Indian groups. So Indian groups oftentimes are going to seek advantage over their other Indian rivals by allying themselves with different European powers. I think this is oftentimes an area of misconception among students, is that because we oftentimes refer to Native Americans in kind of this singular way, like they were all Native Americans, we forget that many times these Native Americans had, for hundreds of years, been in conflict with one another over access to resources, and over territories, etc. And so the arrival of Europeans is not going to end this conflict. Although there will be a few instances in U.S. history of what we call pan-Indian alliances, of Native American groups forming together to resist European encroachment, oftentimes, more often than not, Native American groups sought out Europeans to trade with them, to acquire goods from them, especially guns and things like that, to then be able to take advantage over their other Native American rivals. And so there's a few big groups we want to pay attention to. For instance, the Iroquois Confederation, who you see there in upstate New York, of the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas, are going to oftentimes side with the English to try and acquire manufactured goods. Their big rival will be the Hurons, who are in what are today Quebec. They ally themselves with the French. And this oftentimes leads to wars, and this wasn't the only one, but this is probably the best example, because this leads to a series of wars that's called the Beaver Wars. And it was a result of these competitions between Native American groups who sought control and access to trade with Europeans. They're literally fighting over access to beavers. So they want access to those beaver pelts, which were then traded with Europeans for those manufactured goods. And so we see these Native Americans oftentimes in conflict with one another, and they're oftentimes armed by Europeans who are trading guns to the Native Americans. Now, not only were they in conflict with one another, but oftentimes they were often in conflict with British colonists as well. And a key idea too, British conflict with American Indians over land, resources, and political boundaries led to military confrontations, the biggest one being King Philip's War in New England. So the New England colonies are going to be expanding during this time, especially after the Great Migration. We have 16,000 Puritans moving to the Boston into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This leads to the first war in 1637 called the Pequot War, which I mentioned, and we've seen this slide already in a previous lecture. We're going to see the next one as well. Another major war breaks out in 1675, 1 year before Bacon's Rebellion happens, called King Philip's War, and it's much, much more deadly. It's one of the few instances where we see a pan-Indian alliance. Many different Native American tribes kind of realize, wait a second, we need to do something to stop these Europeans from taking our land, and they form together to fight against the Europeans. They were led by a Native American called King Philip. He had taken on a English name, a quote-unquote Christian name, but King Philip and his entire and most of the Native American tribes over the period of several years are essentially wiped out as a result of King Philip's War, though they do exact a heavy toll on the colonists, killing about 10% of all New England men. Finally, key idea 3 when we talk about the interactions with the Native Americans is that this continuing trade with Europeans by Native Americans is going to increase the flow of goods both in and out of Native American communities. It stimulates cultural as well as economic change, and it spreads epidemic diseases and causes radical demographic shifts among Native American populations. So for instance, if we take this painting of this Native American, we can really just see, just based on this result of trade. Now, for instance, they become increasingly reliant on trade with Europeans. And this really leads to this economic shift for Native Americans. For instance, Native Americans had oftentimes before hunted only out of need or necessity for either pelts for clothing or for food to eat. But now they hunted to be able to then sell those pelts to Europeans to be able to acquire finished products. And so this changed their economic outlook and what they did. It also had drastic, ecological effects where entire species of animals like moose and the beavers were completely eradicated from places like New England. And Native Americans become increasingly reliant on these new technologies. It's going to change American culture. We can see just from this image right here, you see the Native American has a cloth that is made from European cloth. He's carrying a gun. All right. He has many things around him that are based upon this trade with Europeans, and it's going to change this Native American culture. It's also going to lead to a steep decline in Native American populations. Similar to what's happening in Central America, diseases such as smallpox are going to devastate Native populations. 90 to 95% of Native Americans are going to die as a result of their interactions with Europeans from either disease or from war. Well, this ends our lecture for today on Native Americans and their interactions with Europeans. 3 big ideas. 1, Native Americans oftentimes allied themselves with different Europeans, led to conflict among tribes. Native Americans also had conflict with Europeans over land, most notably King Philip's War. And interactions with Europeans is going to change Native Americans, the way that their society is run, the way their economy is run, and is going to devastate their populations as a result of disease. Until next time, go Pack.